Hello and welcome back to Key Comic Universe. I hope you're doing well, and today I'm going to be talking about some common grading misconceptions and mistakes. But before I get into it, please like, comment, and subscribe. If you're not already subscribed, I would recommend it. It would be pretty cool. And also check me out on Instagram at Key Comic Universe, where I do a bunch of comic sales, talk about more comic stuff, and where I also do a bunch of other cool stuff. So be sure to check out. And I'm going to just get straight into this video. So, when you're grading comics, there are some common misconceptions and mistakes that happen, and some of these ones can just be rectified like super easily, be changed up in the future, and other of them are kind of more things that need to be addressed and are kind of more important to just overall grading and grading criteria. So the first one I'm going to talk about, I have a really nice high grade copy of X-Men 205 in front of me. Now this book is nearly flawless. There's like a little bit of like barely visible blunting, and that's it. It's a really nice copy. Awesome book. Now, people online, and you can find this on eBay, you can find this on other websites, but when there's very few issues, some people will assume, oh, this book has to be a 9.8. Oh, I only see one flaw. Oh, I see something that only happened during printing. It's going to get 9.8, 9.9. And then they go out there and they try to sell it as such. And now that's not so much of a thing where it's like, that's the end of the world. But it is something that should be taken into account when you're looking at these really high grade books. And I like to go by the rule of there's no such thing as a guaranteed 9.8. There's no such thing as a guarantee like 9.9. You can get pretty close, you can get pretty accurate, but it's nearly impossible, if not impossible, to predict it 100% of the time without first sending in the book. Plus, if you're sending the book as a 9.8, you send it to your customer, they go and send it into CGC, and they get them back, like, let's say, with a 9.4, 9.6, or there's one tiny error on the inside of the book, on the back cover, something like that, that wasn't noticed. Boom. You have a upset customer. You have someone who's like, oh, I can't trust your grading. And of course, mistakes do happen. But I like to avoid using words that represent, or using a grade that represents a book as a 9.6, 9.8, anything like that. I like to go at most when describing a book, like around a 9.4-ish is really as high as I'll go. Because at that point, you have a pretty good, almost guaranteed chance if, you're looking at this book, you're like, okay, this book looks like a 9.8, right? There's a good chance that book will come back a minimum of a 9.4. Boom, you put it there, you price it as such, and you'll probably have a happy customer if they send it in, or if they get in person, they're going to look at it and be like, oh yeah, that's right on. So that's just like the first little example that I want to mention. I don't think it's necessarily like a issue just strictly with grading. It's more of an issue almost with descriptions, but some people will say, oh no, I can pretty much guarantee that that's going to get 9.8. Oh, I can almost guarantee that that book's going to get 9.9. I'm like 99% sure. And that's where the issue arises. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next issue. And again, these aren't like problems in a way, but they're just things that, when you're grading books, you should be aware of course. Okay, next up, and this is kind of more referring to like low grade books here, or, well, not referring to low grade, but more to older books, I'd say. Even though you'll find a lot of older books mostly in lower grades. But this is just, I guess there's two things I want to talk about with this book. Number one, and this is something that a lot of people really hate seeing on their books. They're like, oh, I can't say my book has this. And that is either a date stamp or the date ran on the book. People feel like that's the end of the world. They market really harshly against books sometimes. But the funny thing, and this is something that a lot of people, I feel like, either aren't aware of or just misunderstand. And that's having a date stamp or having a written date on a book. If it's small, it does not affect grade. Yeah, does not affect grade. I know, it's crazy. It's crazy to think. That's something that's not part of the book, but is on the book, doesn't affect the grade. Now, of course, you rarely will see them as like in a 9.6, 9.8. You'll rarely see that, but it doesn't really affect the grade because it's part of the history And since a lot of books back in those days, like I'm talking 60s, sometimes in the 70s, but mostly like 60s, 50s, earlier, most grading companies, as far as I've seen, won't mark that against you, and it's more of it just a piece of history at that point. So, kind of cool, kind of good information. So if you see someone like marking down a book a ton because of one tiny date stamp, those types of listings, those types of people who like are like, oh, I'm gonna mark this down super low because that ugly date stamp is on there. I always pick up those books, and the reason is because number one, if I still have to get graded, boom, I'm already looking pretty nice because it's going to be coming back most likely, but not all the time, because sometimes there are bigger issues that do keep that grade down. But sometimes there won't be very many other issues or issues that, where it's like doesn't affect the grade as much per se, where that book will still come back looking really, really nice. And the other part is that people, of course, will adjust the price for it. So even if they grade it and they take into consideration, okay, the date stamp is on there, and they're aware of like the grading thing. They'll still, sometimes sellers will still mark it down a bit lower. And you can go in there and get, because they're like, hey, I feel like there's a less likely chance that someone will buy it. Well, here I come. But yeah, that's like the first thing. And the second thing, another thing I see a lot of people really complain about, and this can be seen on the front cover of this book. I get the complaint. I understand it. And it is an issue. And of course, it does have to do with grading. And that's a pop staple. This one has one right down here. So what a lot of people think when you're referring to pop staple is where the staple basically has become detached from the cover, or is barely hanging on from the cover, and there's that tear with it. And so a lot of people hate that. They hate that. And then, of course, it brings down the grade of your book. Yeah, it does bring down the grade of your book. I don't know where I was going to go further with that, but it does bring down the grade of your book. But it's not the end of the world. And I feel like pop staples are also something that get more harshly graded against. Because when people see it, they're like, I hate pop staples. But again, you're going to have to look at the rest of the book, consider what the rest of the book looks like. And again, pop staple isn't the end of the world. You can look at it and you can see, okay, this is a clear issue, this is a problem, but it still fits into X grade. So it's not, so as long as you're still thinking with the grade point, you're all good. It's just something that people grade really harshly against. I definitely get, but just be aware where it fits in at. Look at a grading guide, look at online examples, and it does still affect the grade though. But I see a lot of people grading way too harshly against it, just based upon how it's commonly defined and how it's commonly described. Okay. Let's see. Which topic do I want to move on to? Okay, we'll move on to this one. Yeah, this one might be a little more controversial of a topic because a lot of people that grade do have strong feelings about this, and it's definitely an issue that should be taken into account. So, boom, I've got this book right here, and this book has the horrible, horrible tape on the spine. Tape on the spine. No one likes tape on the spine, and there are a couple of things I want to go in a little bit deeper with this topic. So first off, tape on the spine does affect grade. Whether it's like a repair, whether it's reinforcement, whatever it may be, it does still affect the grade. It's still something that needs to be taken into consideration. But if the cover is detached, or if the spine is split, and this is something that a lot of people are going to disagree with, but I'm just following CGC's grading standards. CGC will oftentimes grade the book a little bit higher because of that tape. Now, I'm not recommending going out there and looking at all your split spine books or all your books with your covers detached and be like, oh, I should definitely just go ahead and tape all these. No, I'm not saying that. But CGC will grade a bit higher with that. I have a book from CGC that has a spine split, and the spine has been, I should have grabbed that one before I did this video, but it has a spine split, and the spine was repaired with tape, and CGC gave the book a 2.0. So if you're grading like a book with a spine split and it's taped, you can still get like anywhere between like a 1.5 and it's as high as like a 2.0 range, maybe a 2.5. I'm unclear on 2.5s, but if the spine is taped, CGC will actually grade a little bit nicer against that. Now, where the cover is detached, it doesn't affect it as much per se, but now you're wondering probably, well, why do you say that's worse? Like, why would you say that you would get a lower grade? And that's, so I'm going to refer back to Overstreet Comic Guide. They say that any form of spine split, whether it's taped or not taped, and this is also, you can check out my comic shop for their thing and their spiel on it, but they also agree with Overstreet where the book's at 0.5, no matter what. It's going to be a 0.5 whether the spine is taped, whether it's just split. No matter what, it's a 0.5. So, you have to also be aware of that. Like, tape, if you're going to sell the book raw or if you're going to follow Overstreet, it's going to be considered 0.5. However, with CGC, you're looking at different grading standards. So, a lot of people will go with one or the other, but just be aware of both and grade accordingly and make sure to represent the book correctly. Because you don't want to be like that guy. It's like, oh yeah, this book's a 2.0 and it has like a split spine, tape on it, and you don't include that. You need to definitely include that information, and that's just something else that's good to be aware of. And then next, and this is the final thing about tape and stuff like that, is tape repair. So, a lot of people don't like tape repair. I don't like tape repair. However, with tape repair, and this is just another example with it, it does affect the grade. But compared to spine split, it doesn't really change the grade too much. So a lot of people would say, oh, well, it has tape repair, so that must be my book's a lot higher grade because it has tape repair. And this also goes in with reinforcement as well. A lot of people back in the day, and this might not be like the most common thing, a lot of people might not have experienced this, but people would reinforce their books with tape. Like the staples still attached, spine still tight, but someone would go in and add tape to the spine, to the interior, stuff like that, and reinforce the book. And that's also going to severely affect the grade. Like, especially since usually it's a lot of tape that's being used for reinforcement, it severely affects the grade. Without like giving a good example or talking about a specific book, it just depends on how much tape. It just depends on how many other flaws and other issues there are with the book. But it's just another thing where it's like, hey, this is a good thing to be aware of. So I'm going to finish up that section. And of course, I can't get too specific on that type of stuff because it's a case by case, grader by grader type of thing. But it's a good thing to be aware of. And, when you're not describing it fully, there can be mistakes in that. Okay. Next up. This is another one that I see a lot of people thinking that it's going to ruin their book. It's going to ruin their grade. But it doesn't. And that is this example. Now, this book looks really nice, right? You might be wondering, well, why would this book ever get like a lower grade? I'm going to go up just a little bit, and you see this little bit right here. So I'm going to bring up. This is spray from old newsstands. So back in the day, with newsstand books, the people who were selling them would give spray to the top of them. I'm not going to get into like the specifics of why and all that type of stuff. It is something that happened in the past. So a lot of people will see this spray on the top of their books and immediately be like, oh no, my book is way lower grade. Or they'll see overspray, and this is a lot more common. They'll see overspray where there's a little bit of that overhang from it, and people will be like, oh no, my book has like this ink smear. My book's completely ruined. However, overspray, especially like on mid, low, even some high grade books, it absolutely does not affect the grade whatsoever. And there's another thing where people think, oh no, it's awful, it's horrible, and it'll often be mislabeled during grading. You got on eBay, people will be like, in the description talking about how there's like an ink smear up on the top, but oftentimes, especially if they show the very top of the book, you can tell if it's like actually an ink smear or if it's just from overspray. And overspray, again, is relatively common. You'll see a lot of time, but not in the end of the world. It does not severely affect the grade of the book. Actually, most of the time, it doesn't have really any impact on it at all. Like this book, like right here, this one's around, what is it? VF range, I think this one is what I have it graded at. But it's around VF range. And unfortunately, or fortunately maybe, the overspray has no effect on it. And that's just another thing to be aware of. If you're getting into like Bronze Age, Silver Age, stuff like that, you'll see overspray on books here and there. And oftentimes, it'll be like, okay, that's fine. But again, does affect eye appeal, so you might be able to find some listings at a little bit of a lower price when there's overspray. So, I mean, that's just kind of another thing to take into consideration. And then we move on to the next topic. This is a topic I've been dealing with a lot recently. And I've been leaving feedback and letting people know about this because people keep on making this mistake and it's awful. It's awful. And it definitely has to do with grading. And I'm going to use this book as an example. This one's honestly really high grade. And luckily the issue does not affect this book too much. But it's really nice from the front. The front is really nice. It presents super well. It's a good looking book. Now, I bought this book way back in the day. And luckily the person online include all the defects on the front. They're like, oh, there's a little tiny indent right up here on the corner. But what they did not mention was the back cover. And you may be wondering, well, if they mentioned that, why didn't they mention the back cover? I've noticed this a lot recently as well. I've been buying into Bronze Age, other stuff, more older books, and a lot of times it just feels like people are lazy, and that's where I get into this. Always check the interior and back cover of your book. This book has a small indent on the back cover. Luckily, it did not affect grade, but the person was so precise on the front cover. They're describing the front cover so well, and they don't even describe the back cover at all, which made me think, oh wow, the back cover must be really nice in the pictures. Oh wow, that looks really nice. But then you get in person, there's a tiny indent, which isn't the end of the world. But I've noticed this a lot though, and people will just either gloss over or they'll think, oh yeah, the front cover will look exactly the same as the back cover. There's going to be no difference. And people often are wrong when making that assumption. So, you have a beautiful front cover, the person doesn't check the back cover, you get in person, you flip it over, and there's a stain, or there's a tear, or someone drew on it. And I should say listing on eBay where a person's trying to sell, I'm not going to say the exact listing, but a person had a picture from back cover, and the back cover is scribbled all over, and they're like, yeah, this book's 8.0, 8.5, it's really nice, the back cover does not affect grade, and it's like, come on. And that's kind of a whole nother different tangent, people getting that type of information wrong or not really understanding it. But always check the back cover of your books, whether you're buying or selling. You don't want to get in a book that looks really nice on the front, the person described it as really nice. You get in, you flip it over, and then boom. You always want to check, you want to make sure that both you and the seller are on the same page. And then also, and this should be somewhat common sense, but if you're to see a high-end book online, and there's 2, 3, 4 pictures, but they're not showing a certain part of the book, always ask. Always ask. You don't want to be pick up that book and be like, no, I didn't ask about X thing, and now X thing comes up. And another thing where I'm talking about this is also checking the interiors. One of the biggest mistakes I see is people picking up Bronze Age Marvel back during the time of the MVS, Marvel Value Stamp, and people just not checking to see if the MVS is intact. And you get in the book, and there's no MVS, and then you're kind of like, oh wow, my book that went from a 6.0, 7.0, whatever it may be, is now a 0.5 or X grade qualified. So that can also end up putting you in a really bad spot. So that's another good thing to check. Always be in communication. Make sure that the seller is doing their due diligence. Do your own due diligence. I think honestly it should be on the seller more than the buyer when doing that and when describing a grade of a book, especially if they're giving a precise grade, and then they're just like, oh, I'm not giving that information. It should be on the seller for the most part, but then if you go ahead and buy it, you want to make sure to double check. You don't want to have any of that liability on your end as well. Okay, final kind of little tiny topic, and this is another one that kind of has to do with something that people don't check for. I don't really have a good example of this, so I'm just going to put up a book because kind of have a visual example, but this, or at least not that I'm aware of. No, I don't think so, because I don't buy books like that. But anyways, staples. Always check your staples. And always check for heavy restoration. Now, this book doesn't have either of those issues, but I'm going to get into this real fast. And first off, number 1, staples. Make sure that the person who you're buying from the book, check if the staples are rusty or not. That's a really important thing to check. Really important thing to be aware of is rusty staples. Now, usually it's pretty obvious, but sometimes, it might be more on the internal side where it's more apparent. Sometimes it's more external. If it's more external, people will notice it way more. Or if it's like a white cover and there's severe discoloration next to the staples, or it's like kind of more that like, I don't want to say bronze color, but where it's darkened or where it's more bronzish, you can definitely tell. But if it's only on like on certain parts of the staple or small parts, sometimes people just won't even notice it. They won't even check. So always check the images. Always check for yourself. Ask questions. Rusty staples do affect the grade. And then the next thing is restoration. Okay, so first off, one grading company that's horrible at checking for restoration, and everyone should be aware of this at this point, PGX. They do not check. Or at least seem to not do a very good job of checking. Don't buy older books from PGX. There's a good chance they'll be restored or have issues that aren't described. And then the other part of this is sometimes people will miss restoration. Now, the easiest ones to check for, actually just the easiest outright to check for, is color touch, black light. So if you're online and someone says the book is unrestored, always check afterwards. I mean, if it's like something really high valued, if it's like a $5, $4, $3 book, I mean, it's still good to check. But you can easily check with UV light, with checking the inside cover, all of that type of stuff for color touch. And you can go out there and check tons of videos out on that, and people will go more in depth on it than me. Other things to check for is marriage. Yeah, marriage. Comics being married. Which sounds weird, but it's basically you take one book, you combine it with another book, and now you have two separate books that are combined into one. And so the easiest way to check is checking the holes, checking paper quality. Like, there's a severe difference in paper quality. It's easy. If the holes are misaligned or if the page is misaligned, easy check. And then I think the other really easy check for that is just checking, like, and this is going to sound really weird, but checking the feel of the book. Like, feeling it out. I know that sounds really weird, but it's a way where you can kind of feel like the actual physical quality. Because even like sometimes the paper might be really similar quality, but they have different tactile feeling. Because especially like with Golden Age and stuff like that, you can tell because a lot of times the same book would have different types of paper used to print it. And I can pull out good examples of that for a future video. But you can check and see if a book is mirrored or not. And then finally, it's like, or not finally, I think I might have one more after this to talk about. But glue. Glue is another really easy one to check for, like, super obvious. Feel the spine. Most times on the spine is stiff. If it has issues, boom, easy, done, out of the way. And what else do I want to check? Oh yeah, and then finally conservation and trimming. So conservation is also easy to check. Usually just because the paper, rice paper used, it's very easy to tell. You can go out there and look at tons of pictures of rice paper used for comic books. It'll pop up immediately. Super easy to check for that. And then finally, this is the hardest one to check for. And a lot of people miss this all the time. And sometimes you won't even know when you get a book like this if it has this issue. Even if you are really good at grading, even if you're really good at checking out your books. And that is trimming. Trimming your comics. So, with like a lot of books, there might be like especially older books, there's a little bit of overhang where the cover overhangs onto it. And that's not always the case, but it is pretty common. And so, people back in the day, they'll get folded over. You'll find folds, and then, people would trim it. They would trim it so that there was no fold in the hope of making the book look better, increase the grade, all that type of stuff. And the reason it's so hard to check is because every single book, and, well, I shouldn't say every single book, but a lot of books aren't exactly the same coming out of the printing press. They aren't perfect all the time. And even and once you get into how books are read, used, worn over time, it gets even more difficult to check for trimming. But the easiest way to check, and again, this isn't a surefire way, but the easiest way in my experience is looking at whether or not the page or the edge is a little bit more lighter in color than like everything else with the book. If it's a little bit more bright, if it's a little bit or yeah, I guess a little bit more bright is kind of okay way to describe it, but that'll stand out for sure. Next is checking like whether or not how far the trimming is, because if it's like super deep trimming where it's like ooh, then it gets a lot more easier to tell. And then also check the paper fibers. Sometimes if it wasn't a very good job, you can sometimes see a little bit of fiber or a little bit of like micro tearing. I guess I'm trying to think about good words to describe it. It's a little bit more difficult. I might actually have to make another video going over the full description. But anyways, those are some examples of common grading mistakes, things that people miss, misconceptions, all of that type of fun stuff. Might make another video in the series. Let me know if this was interesting. Please like, comment, and subscribe. If you're not already subscribed, I would recommend you doing so. And check me out on Instagram at KeyComicUniverse. Do it. Do it now.